everyone, welcome to Briar Haus Writes. I'm Becky Parker, and today it is my honor to be able to have award-winning novelist, short story, and nonfiction writer Sandra Arnold with us. Sandra, I just want to welcome you to the program today. Thank you for agreeing to be a part of Briar Haus Writes.
Thank you for inviting me, Becky. It's really good to be here.
For those of you who don't know, Sandra has a PhD in creative writing. She has been broadcast on international anthologies and on national radio. She has been on the F-Bomb, which is where I had the privilege of getting to hear her speak. She is a master storyteller. She's written several academic papers. She co-founded Takai Literary Journal with David Howard. You have just been so busy.
It has been, yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Well, I grew up in the north of England and I trained as a teacher. After I got married, we lived in New York State for 2 years in Schenectady. Do you know it?
I've heard of it, yes.
Yeah. And our daughter was born there. So she's got American citizenship. Then we returned to England for 4 years while my husband did his PhD. And after that, we moved to New Zealand. Apart from living in Brazil for a year and another year in Oman in the Middle East, we've lived in New Zealand ever since.
What drew you to actually staying in New Zealand?
Well, originally, my husband was offered a job here, and we thought we would go for maybe 4 or 5 years just for an adventure because it was on the other side of the world. But when we got here, I just loved the countryside because there's very little traffic, especially in the South Island, which is where we live. It's quiet and peaceful, a very laid back sort of ethos. And that's what we like. So we lived in the city for a few years while our kids grew up and went to school. And then we moved out to the countryside about 23 years ago in Canterbury. And it's so quiet, so peaceful. And I find with my writing, I do need silence. I can't abide any kind of noise or interruption. So it's so quiet, and I go out under the veranda sometimes with a cup of coffee and just sit there and listen to the birds, and that's the only sound, the birds. It was funny though, because my daughter moved to Australia and she rings me every day, usually in the evening, and the birds in Australia are extremely noisy. They're called ibis, and she could hear them I could hear them in the trees. And I said to her, "Are those children shrieking in a playground or birds?" She said, "Oh, no, 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 these are the birds. We don't
Wow.
have quiet birds in Australia." So I'm just used to here, listening to the occasional bird squeak. So it's quite funny listening to this. Like, it sounded like a whole lot of laughter from these ibis birds. But anyway, we've been over to Australia a few times. And my daughter would like us to go there and live, but I don't like crowds or traffic or snakes or giant spiders, all of which are in Australia. So in New Zealand, we have no snakes. It's very quiet, very peaceful. So I think we'll probably stay here.
Where I live in Tennessee, we have quite a few spiders and snakes
Yeah,
and scorpions, different kind of things. So I think every geographic area seems to have some kind of little nasty surprise that might get us. But except for New Zealand, it sounds magical. I would like that.
yeah, there are no snakes, and the spiders are not giant sized. There's nothing really here that would harm you, I think.
Wow, that sounds like a beautiful place to be.
But
Well,
really, yeah.
Sandra, tell me about what actually drew you to writing.
Well, and I think it all stemmed from my father. He was a great storyteller. And when I was a child, as I grew up, he would make up stories and tell me. And then as I was older, I would give him the title and theme of a story that I'd like him to tell me. And then he'd go away to work and think about it and make it up, and then come back that evening and tell me. He also bought me lots of books. every birthday and Christmas. And I remember when I was about 11, probably, joining the local library and walking home with Wuthering Heights, and that was open as I just walked home. Didn't want to get the bus, just wanted to walk, literally with my nose in the book. Around about the same time, I started writing my own stories and poems. And it just continued like that. You know, I went to teachers' college, qualified as a teacher, wrote poems and stories, not for publication because they were just awful things, but continue doing that. And then I wrote my first novel, probably, I think that was about 1992, when I felt that I actually had something that was more solid. And at the same time, I started writing stories for radio, and they were published or broadcast here on radio. And I just carried on doing that for quite a few years. At the same time as I was teaching at the Polytechnic, teaching English as a foreign language. So I wrote mostly in the evenings and at weekends, but there's always a story in my head, always. So there's always some writing to do. And then in 2002, my youngest daughter, who was 22, was diagnosed with cancer of the appendix, and she died a year later.
Mm-hmm.
So for a whole year afterwards, I couldn't write, I couldn't read, I could barely breathe. It was so traumatic. And then I went back to work, and then about a year later, I thought, if I write it down, it'll actually get it out of my head. And so I started writing down the whole thing about what happened. And I started to do some research on the topic of parental bereavement in bereaving young adult child deaths. And there was nothing, very, very little, not for that age group. So I did a lot of research on that, and I thought, I'll write the book on that. There isn't anything, certainly nothing that helped me, that appealed to me. So I wrote it, and I thought the best way to do that and probably get it out for publication was to do it as a PhD. So I enrolled in a PhD in creative writing, and wrote the whole thing, my personal experience plus everything that I'd researched. And then when that was finished, I put it into a book form and submitted it here to Canterbury University Press, and they published it as a book. And I've heard that it actually has helped quite a lot of people. So it was published as a book called Sing No Sad Songs, which I felt was an appropriate title for parental bereavement. And then after that in a way freed me up to start writing fiction again. So I carried on with that. Continued until about, probably it would be around 2014, I think it was. Yeah. Well, there were a couple of times I did take some time off when I got two writing residencies at different places, and I wrote a novel at each time on each residency. One of them was called The Ash, the Well, and the Bluebell, and that was published in 2019 in New Zealand. And there was another one, published a book of flash fiction called Soul Etchings, that was published in England. Then carried on writing, and about I think 2023, I had a book of short stories published in Australia, and that was called When the Wind Blows. And at the same time, another book of flash fiction called The Bones of the Story, also published in England. And The Bones of the Story was a novella in flash. That's 12 flash fiction stories, all related on a theme. And then in 2024, the last one was published. That was called Below Ground, another flash fiction book. And so now I'm about halfway through another one, another flash fiction book.
What is the theme of that one will be?
I haven't got it's really not so much a theme. I am very interested in how trauma affects people or different kinds of trauma. So quite a few of the stories are related to that. And then when I've finished it, then I'll tidy it all up, put it all together, and get it published probably.
Sandra, one of the quotes that I heard that you had said was, fiction is created with many different strands of the real and the imagined.
Yeah, yeah.
Can you elaborate about that?
I think everyone's different and everyone writes in a different way. But for me, there's always a story in my head. And this is simply because stories are everywhere.
Hmm.
You know, you can be sitting in a cafe with a cup of coffee and I look across and see people, look at the expressions on their faces, and then start to imagine what the relationship is.
Right.
Um, Hear the tone of voice sometimes. So that often triggers something off. And then I start imagining who these people are, what sort of a relationship they have, and have they had a problem? Have they had some kind of trauma? Then I go away and write that story. And the story might, for flash fiction, particularly when I'm writing flash fiction, it can take quite a long time to write. People often think because it's flash fiction, which is a story between 100 and 1,000 words, they think it must be quite easy to write because it's not long, but it's not the case. It's just no more because it's short. It doesn't make it any easier to write than say writing a poem. Uh, in flash fiction, it's different to poetry because there has to be a narrative arc, and that means there's a beginning, a middle, and an end.
Hmm.
But it's not necessarily in that order, so it can start with the end and then go backwards to what I imagine the beginning might have been. Um, and I really like it. I like it as a genre because every word must count. There's no room in flash fiction for a lot of description, which I also like doing if I'm writing a novel or a short story of 2,000 words. But for flash fiction, most of the story has to take place in the reader's imagination. So every word has to count. And with the kind of flash fiction I like to read and I like to write, it should really, it's not something that can be quickly glossed over, but something that could be read again and enters the heart, enters the brain, and makes the reader want to think about it and read it again. And when I'm writing a story, then I leave it for a few weeks, come back to it, read it out aloud and see if any of those words just are not appropriate or there are too many words. So I'm constantly cutting, cutting, cutting. And then when I start cutting to the point where it just looks like a skeleton with no flesh on, and I think, right, it's time to leave this, time to let it go. But it also, I find it, if I'm writing a longer short story, so for example, 2,000, 2,500 words, or a piece of nonfiction or an essay, having been writing flash fiction now for a few years, it helps me to think about what is important, what can be left out. Is this description really necessary? What can be left to the reader's imagination? So it's a genre I would really recommend people read if they haven't already started.
Well, it sounds like that you really have to have some focusing skills to be able to narrow it down first to what you want to write about, and then maybe some listening skills to those characters to see how they're going to actually finish the story for you.
Well, that's right. Yes, and I came across it when I think it was 2016. Yeah, 2016. And I was talking to a friend of mine, Jim Norcliffe, who is a poet and lives in Christchurch. Um, and he told me about a flash fiction magazine in Christchurch called Flash Frontier, which was started by Michelle Elvey, and he became one of the editors. And he said the word limit for it was through 250 words. And I was arguing with him. I said, I don't see how a story, everything in the story could be conveyed in just 250 words, because I was used to writing novels, short stories, nonfiction, essays, and so on. So he said, well, have a look at Flash Frontier and see if you want to change your mind. And I did, and was completely blown away by it, by the beauty of the stories, the language that people chose to use and the way the stories made me feel. And I thought, it is absolutely lovely. It's beautiful. And I hadn't come across that genre before. And so then his next challenge was, well, if you like the stories, why don't you try writing it? So I did, and found it wasn't as easy as I imagined it was going to be. But I did it and sent those off to various places and got them published. And then eventually I had my first collection, which was So Letchings, and that sent that off to a flash fiction publisher in England. And that was published in 2019. And I've really just continued ever since, doing that with the occasional essay maybe thrown in, but I haven't really wanted to write another novel just yet. So I really love getting to grips with the invisibility probably of flash fiction, and the fact that everywhere there is a story, and people often say, where do you get your ideas? Well, they're there. You just have to look, and you just have to listen, see them in absolutely everything, and then go away and start writing. And of course, once you put these words on the paper, then that's when the imagination kicks in, and the whole story then just writes itself in a way. But of course, then you have to come back and edit it and make sure everything is as perfect as you can make it before you send it off to a publisher.
Well, Sandra, will you read some of your work for us?
So as I mentioned to you, it's quite there's quite a variety in the word count. So it can be as small as 100 words. That's often called microfiction. So I'll start off with this microfiction, which is only 100 words, and it's called A Broken Eggshell and a Spider. My children find a finch's nest blown out of a tree in a storm. Inside lies half a tiny egg, on top of which sits a minuscule spider. I watch their faces as their father shows them how the nest is woven with hair from our dog, lined with fleece from our sheep, and feathers from our hens, and how it has been fastened with a twig to strands of straw. He shows them how to handle the nest without disturbing the spider. They watch, scarcely breathing. So that came from a memory of what actually I really saw with my children and their father.
And the way you ended it was beautiful.
Thank you. I've got another one which is longer. This one's called Fire and Ice. When Angela was 7, she asked her mother what kind of meat was on her plate. It's rabbit, said her mother. Tears dripped down Angela's face. Like Snowdrop next door? For the next 6 months, she would only eat meat if her mother promised that it wasn't killed, that it came out of a tin, until her father yelled that he wasn't going to put up with his bloody nonsense a minute longer, and shoved a plate of fatty bacon in front of her, threatening to stuff it down her bloody throat if she didn't eat it now. As soon as the bacon was in her mouth, she rushed out to the washhouse and threw up in her father's work boots. After the ferocity of the beating and the neighbours hammering on the door, he locked her in the coal cellar for the rest of the freezing, pitch-black night. Jamie's mother lamented to her sister that Jamie had never had a girlfriend, and she couldn't understand it, because he surely must have met hundreds of girls at university by now. Her sister replied that girls these days only went for bad boys. Besides, what kind of girls studied physics and astronomy? 3 weeks before graduation, Jamie phoned his mother to say he'd like to bring a friend home for dinner, Angela. They worked in the labs together. His mother was speechless for a whole minute. Before she gathered her wits for an interrogation, she heard Jamie utter an unfamiliar word. Angela's vegan, Jamie repeated. Me too now. We don't eat dead animals. But, what about roast beef and Yorkshire pudding? It's your favourite meal. Not anymore, Jamie said. But don't worry, Angela and I like cooking, and we'll bring plenty of food. On Sunday, Jamie's mother eyed the lentil and coconut dal that Angela set down on the table and gave a tight smile. During dinner, she noted that Angela avoided answering questions about her parents or her background and talked only about things called solar wind, ions, and energetic particles. But Jamie's mother couldn't miss the way they looked at each other. While Angela was out of earshot, she asked Jamie if they were planning on getting married after university. No, said Jamie, Angela doesn't believe in marriage. Oh, what about children? Jamie shook his head. Angela doesn't want to bring children into this world. Why not? It's complicated. So, what does Angela want? She wants to live in Iceland. Inside the cabin, Jamie laid the wood for the fire and struck a match. Angela stepped outside into the black, frigid night. When the cold penetrated her bones, she looked back at the window and saw flames on the hearth. Then she called him. Jamie came out and waited with her. Ribbons of green and blue light began to ripple and flare across the sky. In the icy air, Angela felt the heat from the fire in Jamie's arms and the warmth of his cheek against hers. Oh, this one's called A Multiplicity of Whens. And this one, I think it was just as I was walking past the cathedral in Christchurch, and I saw something that was, I thought, very strange. So I wrote this story. Crackling in the air, a dearth of words. Whens, your perseverance is admirable, but it really is time for you to lie down and die. Whens walked towards the cathedral, towards a man sitting by the door, gripping a bottle of meths. Something about his face, something about his bent body, something about his mottled blue hands. Whens asked him what he was doing. He said he'd been released from prison and had nowhere to go. Whens helped him up and ushered him inside. Two women in fake fur jackets turned from their task of stacking prayer books. They blocked his entrance. You can't come in here, they tisk-tisked. Their Chanel No. 5 overpowering the man's stink. The man's bottle slid from his hands and dropped to the carpet. His fingers fluttered like frightened birds. His voice a whisper. How dare you judge me? Only one person can judge me, and that person is not you. The fake furs looked at each other. They stared at the ground. Tight-lipped, they stepped aside. The man picked up his bottle and clutched it to his chest. Whens led the man to a pew at the back. His eyes roamed over the jewel, bright-stained glass windows, up to the soaring ceiling, and then closed tight. They stayed closed as he whispered his story. He didn't drink from his meth's bottle for that whole hour. When he fell silent, Wens asked him to tell her about a time he was happy. He took a deep breath in and a slow, juddering breath out. When I worked on a fishing boat, when I heard the cries of whales, when the sea was dark as ink, when an albatross glided over the boat, when I saw the sun rising over the rim of the earth. That's that.
I love when you said they're fake furs. You called them that. Sandra, when you're not busy writing and creating, what do you like to do? What are your hobbies?
I don't have hobbies as such. I read, I read voraciously. And I think when you're writing, you do need to read and read in every genre, not just in the genre that you happen to write in. That's my opinion. So I read a lot. I read nonfiction, read fiction, uh, novel, short fiction, and I do that. Then when I'm on a lovely day like it is today, for instance, we've actually finally got some sunshine. My husband and I like to go for walks. So we live in a beautiful, quiet country village with lots of lovely walks around, quiet country lanes, no noise, no traffic. And we take our dog down to the river. And I find that so restorative because, again, you can only hear the silence, the dog splashing in the river, the birds, absolutely beautiful. So I find that that refreshes me, but it wouldn't add up to what people would necessarily refer to as fun.
I think it depends on who you're talking to. That sounds pretty cool. Sandra, when you first started out, did anyone give you any advice about your writing? And did they mentor you? Anybody?
I joined a writing group in Christchurch. I remember when I started doing that, started writing. And there were some very good experienced writers there. And I think it's from my memory, the sort of advice they give, which to me is such common sense. If you if you want to be a writer, you really must read and read everything. And then not just read for pleasure, although there is that in it as well, but
Mhm.
analyze everything you read. Um, for instance, I started reading recently some detective books that my husband loves detective books. And I didn't have my own books to read. So I borrowed his and I read through these and I thought, oh, this is a really good writer. She's an English writer. But I found that I think she was last published probably in the 70s. She was quite old by then. And the writing there was just too much explanation, too many adverbs, too many adjectives. And so that was the part of me reading analytically. I read the bit for pleasure about how the detective solved the crime, but also analyzed the language. And I thought, I don't think many people would write like this these days. I think probably most people, maybe I'm exaggerating there. I would say that this is what I've observed in newer writing. There's far less of that, just putting too many adjectives, adverbs in, over explaining things. So yeah, I think that early advice, read, but also analyze.
I think that's very good advice.
Yeah.
Sandra, when you, in 300 years, when people are reading your work, what do you want them to glean from your work?
I would just like them to, I would like it when people read something and it reaches into their heart. It's something that maybe they can identify with, or maybe something they haven't thought about before. The language, um, it's a hard one, really. I suppose to simplify, just I want people to read my stories, enjoy them, and people enjoy things on many different levels.
And share them. I I really want people to share your work. Um, One of the things that Sandra participates in is F-Bomb, and I strongly encourage you that if you haven't seen her work on F-Bomb, please do so. And Sandra, also tell people where you can be found online. You have a website.
So yeah, well, I've got a website, sandraarnold.co.nz. And so some of the things that I have, well, all of the things that I've published, I put on the website, so that this is always useful to store the work that you've put on the titles where people can find it. It's also useful to send to publishers if you want to publish something in a book form because they want to know what you have written.
Right.
So that's probably the best way.
And also, if you Google Sandra, you can find interviews that she has had with different publications. But she is really terrific. I strongly encourage everyone to read her work. She's awesome.
With flash fiction, it's such a versatile form. It was written in one sentence. Um, and this is a story that comes from a memory of my daughter who used to ride her horse. Okay, so it's called Whistle Down the Wind. Every spring, the woman digs her garden wearing the riding boots her daughter wore the day she galloped her horse through the river, his hooves shooting spray high into the air, each drop twisting and turning in the sunlight and glittering like gems, and the horse's white mane flying in the wind, and the rider's red hair flaring like flames as she raced her horse towards a steep bank, that the horse jumped with ease, his hooves flicking up the bare earth as he landed at the top, with the girl laughing and whooping as they raced towards a higher bank, and the sweat glistening on the horse's flanks, and clouds of breath steaming from his nostrils, and horse and rider flying in perfect harmony. And each spring, when the woman plunges her spade into the earth, she remembers every detail the farmer told her about standing on his tractor, watching a horse and rider galloping through the river, and the sheer heart-stopping beauty of the frothing water and the clattering hooves, trying to get a grip on the highest bank, and the scattering of earth and the whistling wind and the startled birds, and the girl's laughter as she went flying up and up, and the horse's whinnying, and then the silence and the pervading scent of wildflowers. And the woman feels each beat of the story pulsating through her veins and in her heart when she wears her daughter's boots to dig in the garden so she can sow the wildflower seeds that grow so sturdy they withstand the strongest wind. And bees and butterflies will cover the flowers, and birds will scatter the seeds until every last bit of bare empty earth in her garden is filled with their scent and sound and color. And that one again just came from a walk, one of my many walks along the river. And the whole story came in one sentence. And so then when I got back home, I wrote it out. It needed a little bit of polishing, but it didn't take as long as most of my stories do. So that's just another example. Flash fiction is versatile. It can be 100 words, it can be 1,000 words, it could be written in one sentence, it can be almost like a prose poem, as that one sentence story is.
And all of it filled with tremendous emotion and
Yeah.
memory. And I think your daughter would be so proud of her mom. She really would. And we are
Thank
too. I'm so honored that you were part of our program today, Sandra.
oh,
And I wish you
thank you very much.